G'day, Dave here. There's a beauty in humility, isn't there? Something very attractive about people who are selfless, people who put others before themselves. The most supreme, ultimate example of this is Jesus. And we see in Philippians chapter 2 the picture of Jesus, who in very nature God, gives up his dignity, becomes a human being, dies upon a cross so that we can be right with God. And that picture of Jesus is an example to us. We are to have the same mindset as Jesus. You see Paul in this letter to the Philippians calling people to follow Jesus, to have his attitude, his mindset, to be like him. Well, we're looking now at the latter part of chapter 2, and in these last two paragraphs, Paul identifies two friends, people well known to him, well known to the Philippian church, and he puts them forward as examples of humility as well. The first is Timothy. He's a co-worker with Paul. The second is a bloke called Epaphroditus, and he was one of them. And I think if they had been feeling, well, how can we ever be like Jesus? How can we be like Paul? How can we even be like his co-worker Timothy? When they hear the name Epaphroditus, there shouldn't be any excuses, because he's one of them, and yet Paul gives him as an example to follow. Now let's read on in Philippians chapter 2. I'm going to read from verse 19. Listen to this. First of all, about Timothy. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I've no one else like him who shows a genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me, and I'm confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. Paul, again, he's writing from prison. It seems that Timothy's there with him. He wants to send Timothy back to encourage them. And as he writes about Timothy, he speaks very generously about his attitude of humility. Now look at verse 20. It's a sad verse, but it's a great verse. He says, I've no one else like him. That's the sad bit. And then here's the great bit, who will show genuine concern for your welfare. You see, with Timothy, you've got the real deal. Timothy's not putting on a show. He's not looking at praise from people. He's just genuinely committed to them. That's what humility is like. That's what Christian service is to be like. Timothy, not concerned for his own interests, but those of Jesus Christ. And it's his concern for the interests of Jesus that make him committed to the serving of those people, the Philippian church. Verse 22, Timothy has proved himself, because like a son with his father, that is Paul, he's served with Paul in the work of the gospel. Paul, Timothy, they're focused on serving Jesus, serving the work of the gospel, that is proclaiming the good news about Jesus, letting other people know about that, and then encouraging Christians to live following Jesus, showing humility in their lives. There's a great example to follow, Timothy. But next, he outlines Epaphroditus, one of the Philippians, as an example. Verse 25, but I think it necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill. He almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad and I may have less anxiety. So then welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honour people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help that you yourselves could not give me. Paul is giving another example of humility in action. Epaphroditus, and look at the way Paul describes him as a fellow worker, as a brother, as a fellow soldier, but he's also come from them as their messenger, because the Philippian Christians sent Epaphroditus to Paul, who's in prison, to help take care of his needs. But now he's become ill. He's sick. And he's concerned that they might be distressed because they've heard that he's ill. It's interesting, isn't it? I've been ill many, many times, and I get distressed as well. And I get distressed that people might know that I am ill. Epaphroditus gets distressed that people might be worried that he's ill. I kind of want people to know, woe is me, here's my suffering. I'll be more likely to grumble and complain, but for Epaphroditus, he's just concerned that they might be upset because they've heard that he's actually ill. And so Paul's keen to send him back that they might realise that he's doing okay and that he might be received with gladness, and that Paul might not have the anxiety of worrying about how the church is going. Here's an example of humble service. He almost dies for the work of the gospel. He almost loses his life for looking out for the Apostle Paul's needs in prison. Friends, two examples of humility. Well, actually, this is riding on the coattails of Jesus' example of humility. And then there's really Paul's example of humility. And then there's Timothy's humility. And now there's Epaphroditus' humility. We're to get the lesson, I take it, that humility is to shape and characterize Christian experience and Christian relationships. Humility, humility, humility. We're called to be humble. There's something beautiful, isn't there, about seeing people who are genuinely humble. We have a lady who rings us up once every 3 months. She's in her late 90s. We've known her since she was in her 60s, and we thought she was old then. But she rings us up to ask what she can pray for. Humbly asking if she can be praying for us, for our church, for the ministry that we're involved in, for things going on in our lives, looking out for our children. She's a wonderful servant. She's not worried about her needs, but she's looking out for ours. As I look back over many years in church, there are people who just stand out. My friend Trevor, he'd always get to church early and leave late. He'd always be lifting and carrying the heavy stuff. He'd be stacking out the chairs and packing them up again. He'd be putting the speakers in place and the heavy stage equipment and other things. Not on a roster, not because he was expected to do it, just volunteering, serving, humbly. Friends, there's something very beautiful about humility, and there's something profoundly important when that humility is shaped by Jesus and Jesus' desire to see other people's lives changed. One of the joys of being a pastor now in a church for a number of decades is seeing God changing people, seeing people who've really been pretty selfish turned around so that they're now living not for themselves but for Jesus, and to serve the gospel and to look out for the needs of others. It's very appealing. And it's a humble example to you and to me to follow. I want to ask us as we look at this, if you know Jesus and you're following him, what kind of an example are you setting? Would Paul write about you as he writes about Epaphroditus or about Timothy? Would he say, look at me and follow his example and be looking to other people's needs? Or would he be calling us to respond by not being selfish or grumbling and complaining, but realizing again the need to be glad and to be thankful for all that God's given us, so that we in turn can learn to give to others, to give our lives for their sakes? That's what we see here. Timothy, Epaphroditus, they love Jesus. They're serving Jesus, and that leads them to humbly give themselves for the sake of others. Will we do the same?